In the quiet hours before the first light of dawn filtered over the tiled rooftops of ancient Rome, a soft hum stirred in the alleys near the Forum Boarium. The paving stones, damp with dew and worn smooth by the soles of thousands of sandals, bore witness to the rhythms of those lives lived not in triumph or oratory, but in toil and repetition. Among them were the men and women whose names were seldom recorded in the ledgers of senators or poets, individuals whose occupations, though mundane, formed the sinews of a city that, at its peak, governed over 50 million souls. As the nubilarium, a kind of cloud observer or amateur meteorologist, stepped quietly onto the upper level of his domus, he tilted his head and studied the sky. His task was not grand, yet it was necessary. With narrow eyes and a calloused hand raised to shield against the pale horizon, he murmured notes to himself regarding the shapes of the early clouds. He made careful comparisons to previous mornings in his wax tablet, noting the prevalence of nubes fuscae, or dark clouds, suggesting a likelihood of humidity. Merchants who transported amphorae of olive oil along the Tiber might consult him in exchange for modest coin or bread, hoping to avoid the unexpected storms that could ruin delicate goods. Further inland from the Tiber's gentle ripple, a phalanca prepared for its opening. The phallones, or Roman launderers, were responsible for cleaning the garments of the city's wealthier citizens. Before the sun rose high enough to warm the roof tiles, the launderers stirred mixtures of water and aged urine, collected from public urinals, into large tubs of clothing. The ammonia content, though malodorous, was ideal for breaking down grease and restoring the whiteness of tunics and togas. The clothes were trampled underfoot in rhythmic unison, slow, squelching steps, accompanied by the occasional murmur of a work chant, though most of the phallones worked in relative silence. Between sessions, they used brushes made from reeds and animal hair to scrub particularly soiled cloth. Once rinsed, the fabric was hung across tightly stretched lines strung between beams of wood or stone, fluttering gently in the mild breeze, their pale folds catching morning light like sails. Not far from the phalanca, in the shaded recess of a cramped workshop near the Subura district, a sandalarius, or sandal maker, unfolded a piece of cured oxhide. His space was long and narrow, with shelves stacked high with leather strips, wooden soles, bronze buckles, and pumice stones for smoothing rough edges. Beside a window covered with thin linen to diffuse the light, he seated himself on a three-legged stool and dipped a sponge in olive oil to soften the leather. He would trace the outline of a customer's foot using charcoal on thin parchment, then cut carefully with a small blade, its handle worn smooth from decades of service. In the courtyard behind the shop, the tanning pit still emitted the sour-sweet aroma of curing hides, though the worst of the stench had subsided with time and exposure. Meanwhile, in one of the many shaded lanes where clay and dust formed a fine, persistent layer over everything, a Ciciarius, or hired cart driver, stood beside his humble Cicium, a small two-wheeled cart pulled by a single mule. The animal, dappled gray and patient, flicked its ears at the morning flies, while the Ciciarius adjusted the bindings on the harness. His tunic, once red but faded now to a soft pink, bore the signs of his trade: dust along the hem, worn patches at the knees, a faint sheen of oil from countless hours of gripping the reins. His clients were usually merchants who wished to move modest amounts of goods from the port to the markets, or older citizens too frail to walk the length of the forum. The Ciciarius did not speak unless spoken to, preferring to let the clip-clop of his mule speak for the progress of the day. Along the outer perimeter of the Aventine Hill, where the air was clearer and the homes less densely packed, an Apifex testiciarius, or brickmaker, stirred from his straw bedding. His kiln, built partly into the slope of the hill, had cooled overnight, but the warm embers still glowed faintly beneath the layer of ash. The brickmaker, thin and stooped, pulled his hooded tunic tight against the morning chill, and inspected the stacked rows of freshly fired bricks. They bore the distinctive stamp of his employer. Each estate or construction firm had its own insignia impressed into the soft clay before baking. Using a narrow iron tool, he chipped away at the excess slag formed during firing and placed the finished bricks into neat rows, ready for delivery. Back in the bustling heart of the city, a tessellarius, or mosaic tile maker, crouched before a wooden tray filled with hundreds of tiny cubes. The tesserae, made from limestone, marble, glass, and terracotta, were sorted by color and material. The workshop was dim and cool, the floor littered with chalk sketches of designs, ranging from simple geometric patterns to detailed mythological scenes destined for the floors of bathhouses or wealthy domus atria. The tessellarius dipped his tools into a shallow bowl of mortar, carefully applying a thin line, then pressed a blue glass tessera into place with slow deliberation. His fingers, rough and cracked, moved with the steadiness of years. Outside the city's Servian walls, beyond the bustling clamor of citizens and the rhythmic chants of vendors, another figure moved with quiet purpose, the herbarius, or herb seller. He arrived early to the market, his cart pulled by a donkey of gentle temperament, the boards creaking softly under the weight of baskets. Dried lavender, bay leaves, fennel, sage, and hyssop were carefully arranged in cones of woven reed. The herbarius wore a straw hat to shade his lined face and a simple woolen tunic belted at the waist. Each plant was gathered from the fields beyond the geniculum, harvested in accordance with the lunar cycle, and stored in small linen sacks to preserve aroma. Some patrons came seeking flavor for cooking, others remedies for ailments, and still others simple comfort through scent. Even less renowned than the herbarius was the elliptes, or ointment preparer. In a side room of a modest domus near the Campus Martius, the elliptes mixed unguents using pestle and mortar, rose oil for the affluent, goose fat, and herbs for the poor. His jars were clay, sealed with wax or linen, and labeled using ink and narrow reeds. Though his clients were few and uncelebrated, his work formed the cornerstone of care for wrestlers, laborers, and aging citizens suffering from stiffness in the joints. He also maintained a shelf of powdered chalk and pumice used in exfoliating treatments, which were sold to the baths for use by strigils before massage. Meanwhile, in a shaded warehouse along the Tiber's edge, the scriba rationis privati, or private accounting clerk, laid out his scrolls across a long wax table. He was employed by a wealthy grain merchant to keep meticulous records of shipments, weights, prices, and taxes owed to the Portoria Customs Station. The scriba sharpened his stylus with a small flake of obsidian and warmed a pot of ink by placing it near the brazier. The soft crackle of burning charcoal was the only sound in the room. His handwriting, while elegant, had grown slower with age, and his calculations were repeated twice for accuracy. Errors were not punished severely, but they were frowned upon, and he took pride in his precision. Not far from the warehouse, the pister, or miller-baker, stirred a wooden vat of dough with a long-handled paddle. His millstone, powered by mule and lever, had ground spelt and barley into coarse flour just the evening before. The bakery's brick oven had been stoked since the second hour of nightfall, the ash pushed aside to make way for the day's first loaves. The pister's apprentice arranged the dough onto flat boards, scoring the tops with a bronze blade. As the loaves rose, the scent of warm grain filled the narrow street, mingling with the tang of fermenting wine and the earthy smell of unwashed stone. And across the city, beneath the vast, unhurried sky, the city stirred not with urgency, but with its familiar murmur, 1,000 hands tending small, forgotten duties, each bearing the weight of a civilization that depended not on conquest or glory, but on the steady, persistent rhythm of the mundane. In the gentle quiet of the third hour, as the sun climbed slowly over the rooftops of Rome's many insulae, or apartment blocks, another worker emerged into the city's slow rhythm, the tegularius, or roof tile maker. His workshop was located near the Aurelian walls, where access to clay-rich soil was favorable. The tegularius began his day by sifting through yesterday's drying tiles. Each one, shaped by hand or wooden mold, required uniformity to interlock properly when placed upon the pitched roofs of domus and public buildings. With steady fingers, he checked for cracks, irregularities, and thickness. Those with imperfections were broken down and rehydrated to be remolded. Beside his kiln, a low domed structure of brick and hardened mud, he maintained a fire fueled by pinewood, chosen for its even burn. In the back of the workshop, neat rows of curved tegulae and flat imbrices awaited transport, each tile a small but essential shield against the creeping damp of Roman winters. Along the shaded colonnades of the Forum Holatorium, the allator, or greengrocer, displayed his produce upon wooden tables, softened by years of wear. His wares were modest: chickpeas in woven baskets, small bunches of wild onions, radishes, and lentils wrapped in broad cabbage leaves to preserve freshness. There were also apples from Etruria, dried figs from Campania, and bundles of leeks tied neatly with twine. His scales, made of bronze and strung with cords of sinew, hung from a low crossbeam, their pans darkened with use. The allator greeted his patrons with a soft nod, rarely speaking unless asked a price. He measured by weight and feel, guided by decades of experience, and accepted small coinage, asses or dupondi, which he stored in a cloth purse tied to his girdle. Near the theater of Pompey, where shadows lingered long into the morning, a tibason, or flute player, stood in the entrance of a bathhouse. His role was not that of a performer in the theatrical sense, but of an acoustic companion to rituals of cleansing. He played softly, his double flute producing a quiet, reedy harmony as bathers entered or exited. The music was intended to soothe rather than entertain, part of a long-standing tradition wherein music accompanied acts of purification. His flutes, made of boxwood and occasionally bound with bronze rings to prevent splitting, were cared for meticulously. When not in use, they were kept in a leather roll beside his simple bench. Beside the public latrines near the Clivus Argentarius, another worker performed a job so essential, yet so humble, that his name was seldom remembered. He was the Foricarius, the attendant of the latrines. His responsibility was to keep the facility clean, ensure a supply of seawater or vinegar solution for the communal sponge sticks, known as tersoria, and maintain the flow of the water channels beneath the seats. He rose early to sweep the tiled floor with a bundle of twigs, scrub the stone seating with a cloth soaked in lye, and gently clear the drainage trench using a long-handled scraper. He wore a short tunic and sandals bound with thick straps to resist dampness. Though most avoided eye contact with him, he understood the quiet necessity of his work and performed it with unhurried patience. Just beyond the Circus Maximus, a Fabri Ferrari, or ironworker, opened the wooden shutters of his narrow shop. Unlike the celebrated weaponsmiths of legend, this ironworker focused on more modest items: hinges, door bolts, horseshoes, keys, and iron nails of various lengths. His anvil, set upon a stump of oak, bore the polished sheen of long use. He worked with a small hand bellows, keeping the fire hot enough to soften metal, but not overly aggressive. Sparks floated lazily upward as he tapped the iron into shape with short, regular strokes. The air carried the smell of burning charcoal, faint but steady, mingling with the metallic tang of heated ore. Farther south, within a shaded garden beside a temple precinct, a topiarius, or ornamental gardener, stooped carefully beside a clipped laurel hedge. His shears, with bronze blades and handles wrapped in softened leather, made only the faintest rustling sound as they snipped small leaves from the growing topiary. The topiarius maintained not only shapes of birds and mythic animals, but also geometric patterns that pleased the sensibilities of upper-class homeowners and temple caretakers. Each morning he walked slowly through the garden paths, inspecting the moisture of the soil with his fingertips, assessing the growth of ivy across stone columns, and adjusting support ties for climbing roses. His pace was deliberate, his silence uninterrupted save for the birds and the faint trickle of a fountain nearby. Beyond the Esquiline Hill, the day passed similarly slowly for the coactor Argentarius, a type of debt collector. Contrary to modern expectations, his work did not involve threats or violence. Rather, he moved quietly through the porticos and shaded markets, carrying a wooden writing tablet strapped to his chest, and a bag of tokens used to mark partial payments. He greeted clients with formal courtesy, collected small sums, and issued wax-sealed acknowledgments. He would pause often, recording entries in tidy Greek letters, tallying figures, and stopping under awnings to avoid the harsh midday sun. His role was respected, if not beloved, and many merchants appreciated his honesty and patience in recording debts. In a small taberna tucked away behind the Temple of Saturn, the unguentarius, or perfume seller, set his tiny clay bottles in rows along a polished cedar shelf. Each bottle was marked with painted inscriptions: nardum, rosatum, murrey, and malabathrum, subtle blends imported from the East, or created in the back room with base oils and crushed petals. The unguentarius maintained a mortar and pestle for grinding spices, a bronze funnel for bottling, and linen rags for wiping clean each container before sale. His fingers bore the faint sheen of oil at all times, and his workspace smelled faintly of roses, cinnamon, and resin. His customers were often women of moderate means, seeking a modest scent for their hair or wrists. Meanwhile, at the city's northern edge, the calcareus, or lime burner, toiled near the quarries. His kiln was large, built from fired bricks, and fed with long, slow-burning logs. He loaded it with limestone and maintained a precise temperature for hours at a time to transform the stone into quicklime, used for mortar, plaster, and whitewash. The process was laborious and required a slow, constant watch. He used a long iron hook to shift the stones, and opened the kiln only sparingly to inspect progress. When finished, he shoveled the lime into rough sacks made of hemp and stored them in dry sheds, careful to keep them from moisture, which would prematurely activate the chemical process. In another neighborhood, closer to the heart of the city, the fabri-tignari, or woodworkers, shaped beams for construction. Using iron axes, adzes, and rasps, they worked oak, elm, and cypress into door frames, tables, and beams for ceilings. Their saws, fixed into tall frames, required 2 workers to operate, one above and one below the plank. Shavings curled from blades like parchment, swept into piles at day's end. Their shop smelled of sap and sawdust, warm and dry. Above the doorway hung a simple painted sign, a saw crossed with a mallet, signifying their quiet presence. Throughout the late morning, as the sun grew stronger and shadows shrank, the aquarii, or water carriers, began their rounds. Although aqueducts carried water into the city, much of it required manual transport from fountains to homes. These aquarii, often freedmen or laborers, filled clay jars or leather sacks and hoisted them over their backs, delivering fresh water to tenement dwellers who lived far from a public fountain. Their routes were long and slow, the water heavy, and their journeys punctuated by brief rests in shaded corners. Most walked barefoot to better navigate the uneven stones, their feet hardened by years of repetition. They were paid a modest fee, usually daily, and remembered each household's preference for how full to fill the jars and where to place them, details noted silently and dutifully. As midday approached and the air grew still, the city seemed to shimmer under the weight of its own inertia. Yet within its walls, the smallest of tasks continued in steady procession. Each job, each motion, another thread in the quiet fabric of Rome. As the noon hour settled over the city of Rome, a warm haze began to soften the edges of marble columns and roof lines. The activity within the streets did not halt, but it slowed. Even the clatter of sandals over stone grew sparse, muffled by the heat radiating from sunlit walls. In this lull, the caupo, or innkeeper, moved slowly between narrow wooden tables in the shaded interior of his modest establishment near the Via Salaria. His tasks were unhurried, refilling oil lamps with thick yellowish oil pressed from local olives, wiping down worn tabletops with a damp cloth, and adjusting clay cups upon a shelf above the counter. The air inside was cool and dim, carrying the faint aroma of stewed lentils, sour wine, and dried thyme. Behind the capona, in a separate, darker room, the cocus, or cook, stirred a pot over a low fire, occasionally adding a handful of ground coriander or crushed garlic. His implements were simple: wooden spoons, iron knives, ceramic bowls, and a mortar for spices. The day's offerings included a barley porridge, sweetened with dates and honey, a salted fish stew thickened with chickpeas, and small loaves of spelt bread served with sheep's cheese. Each dish was prepared with slow deliberation, not for flair, but for sustenance. There was no written menu. Patrons knew what to expect from the season, the scent, and the regular rhythms of the kitchen. Outside, beneath the shade of a leaning awning, the tonsure, or barber, carefully sharpened his razor on a leather strop. His stall, built into a recessed corner of a shop front, consisted of a single wooden chair, a small basin, and a board with combs and shears laid out in an orderly fashion. The tonsur's clientele ranged from laborers to minor officials, all seeking the small luxury of tidiness. He used oil of myrtle to soften the beard, and warm water poured from a clay jug. Conversation was limited to murmured requests. The soundscape was defined more by the soft snip of shears and the scraping of the blade along the jawline. After each cut, he rinsed his tools in vinegar and replaced them in their proper place. Further along, the vicus tuscus, in a workshop carved partly into the stone beneath a larger insula, the vitrarius, or glassblower, sat near the opening of a low brick furnace. The process of glassmaking was steady and repetitive. The vitrarius gathered molten glass onto the end of a hollow iron tube, then slowly inflated it, turning the pipe with practiced ease. The pieces he made were small: cups, unguent bottles, and occasionally beads. He worked with a palette of pale greens and blues, the colors determined by the mineral content of the sand and additives. Each piece was cooled gradually in an annealing oven, then placed on wooden shelves to wait for market day. Nearby, his apprentice ground small bits of glass into powdered frit, ready for future batches. As the afternoon stretched on, a lignarius, or joiner, operated in a shaded workspace just off the argiletum. His focus was not on structural beams or furniture, but on fine wooden items. Written tablets with wax-filled centers, small boxes with fitted lids, combs with delicately carved teeth. He selected olive wood for its hardness, boxwood for its fine grain, and cedar for its fragrance. His tools were well kept and arranged along the edge of his bench: chisels, awls, and gouges, each resting in grooves worn deep from years of use. As he carved a delicate hinge, the only sound was the faint scrape of tool against grain and the occasional breeze rustling the thin linen curtain at the shop's entrance. Down a gentle slope toward the Campus Esquilinus, near the city's burial grounds, a palinter, or embalmer, prepared a body for interment. His work was solemn, performed with calm efficiency. He used linen strips, scented oils, usually a mixture of myrrh and cinnamon, and occasionally resin. The deceased, often of moderate means, were laid on a simple wooden plank. The palinter's tools included a bronze knife for minor incisions and clay bowls for mixing preservatives. Once the body was washed, anointed, and wrapped, it was laid in a stone sarcophagus or wooden coffin, depending on the family's resources. The palinter worked without adornment or fanfare, surrounded by silence save for the distant wind and the muted footfalls of mourners. Elsewhere, nearer the center of civic life, a librarius, or public scribe, sat at a small desk in the portico of the basilica. His tablet rested on a low lectern, and beside it he kept several scrolls: legal contracts, debt acknowledgments, marriage agreements, all written in neat practice Latin. Passers-by might request his services to draft letters, record disputes, or interpret edicts. His stylus was of iron, and he alternated between wax tablets and papyrus, depending on the formality of the document. His robe was modest, dyed a quiet brown, and his hands bore the ink stains of long hours spent copying and correcting. In the heat of the afternoon, he paused frequently to sip watered wine from a small ceramic cup. Beyond the gates, where the road widened into a stretch of open countryside, a subalcus, or swineherd, tended his small group of pigs. The animals grunted and rooted among the underbrush, guided by the rhythmic taps of the subalcus's staff. He wore a broad-brimmed hat to shade his eyes and a cloak fastened at one shoulder, its hem dusty from weeks of wear. He carried a satchel of barley mash and a clay whistle used to call the pigs to heel. His dogs, lean and vigilant, flanked him quietly, their movements fluid and unobtrusive. Occasionally the subalcus would kneel to inspect a hoof, or sit beneath a tree to repair a strap on his sandal, his pace unchanging, his gaze always on the slow movement of his herd. Closer, to the water's edge, along a path frequently used by fishermen, a linterius, or linen worker, unfurled bolts of damp cloth across flat stones to bleach in the sun. The linen, woven nearby by domestic weavers, had been soaked in lye, made from ashes and rainwater. After a thorough rinsing in the river, it was stretched and smoothed by hand. The linterius used heavy stones to keep the fabric taut, adjusting them as the sun moved across the sky. He worked in silence, broken only by the calls of gulls and the distant splash of oars. In the evenings, once the cloth had dried and whitened, it was folded with care and taken back to be cut and sewn into tunics, towels, and veils. As the 9th hour approached, the shadows began to lengthen, stretching across the cobbled streets like drawn-out brushstrokes. The temperature dropped slightly, and a breeze stirred the hanging vines along the walls of wealthy homes. Within one such domus, the vestiarius, or household cloth-keeper, moved quietly between cedar wood chests and woven baskets. He was responsible for the storage, cleaning, and mending of garments belonging to the household, tunics, stolas, pallas, and even ceremonial togas. Each piece of clothing was folded according to custom, some wrapped in perfumed cloths to deter insects. The vestiarius kept a careful record on wax tablets of which garments were in use, which were in need of repair, and which had been worn recently. His work was meticulous, almost meditative, and took place in a chamber cool with shaded air and the faint scent of lavender sachets. As the sun inched closer to the horizon and the murmur of the city softened into an evening hush, it became clear that the heartbeat of Rome lay not only in her temples or tribunals, but in the quiet, deliberate motion of these forgotten trades. Every cobbler's tap, every scribe's flourish, every shepherd's whistle, each played its small, steady part in the long breath of the city, ever constant, ever enduring. As the light of day began to recede from the higher rooftops of the Palatine and dipped gradually into the narrow lanes of the Transtiberine quarter, the pulse of Rome remained gentle, measured, and subdued. The air carried the faint scent of sun-warmed stone, mingled with the more pervasive traces of olive oil, smoke, and the soft tang of dust, stirred by sandals. As households prepared for the quiet of evening, those engaged in the city's more subdued professions concluded their day with slow, ritualistic motions. In a courtyard, lined with potted figs and laurel shrubs, a lanarius, or wool preparer, finished his work beneath an awning of woven reed. He specialized not in weaving or dyeing, but in the earlier stages of wool treatment, washing, carding, and sorting fleece. The raw wool, often brought in from the Sabine hills, arrived in burlap sacks, heavy with lanolin and soil. He soaked it in vats of warm water mixed with wood ash, then rinsed it thoroughly and laid it to dry upon wicker racks. Once dried, he carded the wool using wooden paddles set with fine iron teeth, gently aligning the fibers. The lanarius worked in silence, his rhythm defined by repetition, his thoughts often unspoken. He sorted the wool by coarseness and shade, readying it for delivery to weavers in the city and surrounding countryside. Just 2 streets away, nestled between a bakery and a shrine to Mercury, the fibularius, or brooch maker, completed the day's final polishing of bronze pins. His small workshop contained drawers of wire, lengths of silver, casting molds of stone and clay, and delicate hammers. The fibulae, used to fasten garments at the shoulder or breast, came in various shapes, arched, disc-shaped, or spiral. He cast the forms using molten metal poured into prepared molds, then filed the edges smooth and affixed small decorations when ordered. Some bore modest gems of colored glass, while others had filigree of twisted wire. The fibularius wrapped the finished pieces in cloth and stacked them carefully in cedar boxes, ready for sale at the market. The scent of warm metal and beeswax hung faintly in the air. Down a quiet lane with cracked paving stones and vine-covered walls, a margaritarius, or pearl stringer, worked by lamplight. His tools were few: needle, silk thread, a small stone for smoothing, and a shallow dish filled with river pearls, imported from Gaul or fetched from coastal traders. He strung each pearl carefully, alternating sizes and occasionally placing a small spacer bead of coral or jet. The strings were intended for hair adornments, necklaces, or to be sewn into the hems of garments for those who could afford such delicate beauty. The margaritarius rarely spoke to others. His trade was solitary and contemplative. Each thread was tied with precision. Each pearl passed slowly between fingers, worn smooth from years of touch. Outside the southern city gate, where traffic slowed as day faded, a muleo, or muleteer, tended to his animals. He led them slowly in circles, to stretch their limbs, brushed their coats with bundles of twigs, and inspected hooves for stones or wear. The harnesses, made of leather and lined with cloth to prevent rubbing, were removed and hung to dry. The muleo offered the mules a mash of barley soaked in water and sprinkled with salt, their muzzles dipping into wooden troughs with contented sighs. He whispered to them, not in command, but in familiarity. His day had been long, delivering goods from the countryside to various stalls within the city, and his return to the stables marked a transition into evening. He poured a final bucket of water from the well and leaned against a wooden beam, eyes half closed in calm observation. Along the edges of the Aventine Hill, where shadow fell early, the lucernarius, or lamplighter, began his work. Moving slowly along the streets and walkways, near public buildings and temples, he lit the city's oil lamps one by one. Each bronze or terracotta vessel was carefully filled with thick oil, and the wicks, made from twisted flax, were trimmed and lit with a smoldering splint. The lucernarius carried a wooden ladder balanced on one shoulder, a long taper for reaching high fixtures, and a pouch of replacement wicks. His movements were deliberate, methodical. He paused at each post, adjusted the flame, ensured it burned cleanly, then moved onward into the dusk. His presence brought no applause, only a quiet recognition by those who passed him. An old man, illuminating the edges of night. Elsewhere, along the riverbank where reeds grew tall and the water lapped softly against worn pilings, the reparator rudentum, or rope mender, coiled long lengths of hemp in even circles. Sailors and porters brought him ropes frayed by use, torn, sun-dried, or strained by weight. The reparator examined each segment closely, cut away worn ends, and spliced in new fibers using a bone fid and tarred thread. He dipped the rope ends into melted resin to seal them, then ran the rope through his palms to feel for irregularities. His hands were darkened with tar and callus, and he sat cross-legged upon a folded cloth as the sky dimmed. A small fire burned beside him for warmth and light. Nearby, boats bobbed gently, their hulls creaking, their ropes once again strong. At the foot of the Capitoline Hill, within the storerooms of a granary, a mensor frumenti, or grain measurer, concluded the day's tally. He was responsible for verifying the volumes of grain received, recorded, and issued from state reserves. With a standardized measuring vessel, often a bronze modius, he scooped grain into sacks or amphorae and marked the amounts in his ledger. The ledger, written on a roll of parchment, was kept dry in a wooden case with iron clasps. He reviewed his notes under the yellow glow of a clay oil lamp, then sealed the storage area with a lead token, impressed with the seal of his employer. His sandals crunched softly on spilled grain as he moved, and the faint rustle of rodents in distant corners reminded him that vigilance would begin again tomorrow. Nearby, tucked between the columns of an older basilica, a mendicus honoratus, or licensed beggar, sat quietly, with his hands folded over his lap. Though not formally employed, his role was nonetheless sanctioned by the city. He wore a wooden badge signifying his right to beg in a designated area. He did not speak unless spoken to. In front of him lay a shallow bowl containing a few copper coins, and beside him a linen bundle of his few possessions. At the day's end he gathered the coins, tied them into a cloth, and wrapped his shoulders with a thin woolen cloak. His pace was slow, as he rose to find a sheltered spot for the night, perhaps beneath an overhang or near the warmth of a bakery wall. And in a domus, along the edge of the Kalian hill, the koka, or female cook, began to extinguish the small cooking fire. She removed the clay pots from their rests, scrubbed them with a bundle of grass stems, and placed them upside down to dry on a flat board. The remains of lentil soup, baked pears, and mulled wine were stored in sealed jars to be reheated in the morning. The hearth was swept, and the coals banked to hold a faint glow until dawn. She moved slowly, humming a tune passed down from her mother, her bare feet silent against the tiled floor. Outside, the first cicadas began to call, and the day exhaled its final warmth into the soft, cooling air. Thus, as twilight blanketed the city and its thousands of narrow ways, the work of Rome did not end, but transformed. The pace slowed, the noise softened, and the small acts of cleaning, sorting, measuring, lighting, and folding continued their ancient rhythm in the shadow of temples, arches, and aqueducts. Forgotten by the histories that catalogued battles and emperors, these humble labors carried the weight of civilization, quietly and without acclaim. As night deepened over the 7 hills, the city of Rome settled into its quieter posture. The hum of daily life, once vibrant and echoing across marble and brick, faded into the measured hush of evening. Lamps flickered in windows of upper-story insulae, casting pale amber glows onto the streets below. In this gentler hour, some forms of labor paused entirely, while others merely adjusted to the darkness, continuing with no expectation of notice or acclaim. Beneath the covered portico of a modest domus in the Quirinal district, the vestiarius nocturnus, or night wardrobe attendant, moved in slow circles through the sleeping quarters. Employed by a household of mid-level bureaucrats, his task was to prepare clothing for the next day. Tunics brushed, belts laid out, sandals aligned near the threshold. In one chamber, he gently untied the girdle from a linen stola, folding it with practiced care and placing it on a cedar shelf. In another, he examined the seams of a boy's toga praetexta, lightly worn along the edge, and marked it for mending at dawn. His oil lamp, set upon a brass stand, swayed slightly with each footstep, casting elongated shadows across walls lined with storage chests and shelves. He worked in near silence, interrupted only by the creak of floorboards and the distant hoot of a night bird. Farther east, within the outer walls of a harem or public granary, the custos horae, or night watchman, walked his prescribed path along rows of amphorae and sacks. The structure, built of thick stone and fortified with iron-banded doors, stored grains, salted fish, dried fruit, and occasionally coin reserves. The custos horae carried a short wooden staff, capped with bronze, and a small clapper to signal his presence. At each turn of the corridor, he paused, tapped twice upon the stone, and proceeded. Occasionally, he knelt to examine the seals upon storage jars, checking for signs of tampering or damp. His breath misted in the cool air of the storeroom, and his cloak, worn thick for warmth, brushed softly against the floor. Not far from the Forum of Augustus, the claviger, or key-bearer, made his final rounds of the night. Employed by the curatores of several public buildings, his responsibility was to ensure that each gate, door, and storage room was secured. His ring of iron keys, varying in size and shape, hung from a leather strap across his chest. He moved with deliberation, pausing before each lock, inserting the key, and listening for the click of the bolt as it turned. After securing the gates to the basilica, he crossed to the archives and repeated the process. His notes, made upon a wax tablet, recorded the time and condition of each seal. His sandals made soft contact with the marble floor, and the torch he carried emitted a gentle hiss with each shift of the breeze. In the Subura district, where tenements rose high and the alleys narrowed into shadows, the vicarius nocturnus, or neighborhood caretaker, patrolled his assigned area with calm focus. Although not a soldier, his presence was welcomed by many residents. He checked water basins to ensure none had overflowed, nudged shut any doors left ajar, and gently roused sleeping beggars from dangerous spots where carts might pass. He carried a rope for helping retrieve fallen buckets, and a small pouch of coins to assist the indigent when needed. His tunic, belted tightly, bore the wax seal of the Eatles who employed him. On rare occasions, he would note a cracked beam, a loose roof tile, or a wall with signs of erosion, and report it the next morning for repairs. His progress was slow, each footstep a soft metronome in the deepening quiet. Outside the gates, beyond the city proper, in a villa rustica nestled among rows of olive trees, the Subulcus nocturnus, or night swineherd, remained awake beside a low stone wall. Though his charges had bedded down within the enclosure, he listened for any signs of intrusion, foxes, wolves, or thieves. His fire was low, little more than embers, and he sat cross-legged upon a folded cloak, a staff resting across his knees. Occasionally he would rise, circle the pen, and check the gate latch. The pigs, breathing slowly, barely stirred. A clay jug of water and a pouch of barley bread lay beside him, untouched since sundown. His eyes remained alert, his body still. Back within the city, along the Tiber's bend, where barges bobbed lazily in the current, a noclerus, or boat overseer, supervised the securing of a newly arrived grain shipment. The sailors had long since finished their duties and retired to hammocks strung beneath the barge's canopy, but the noclerus remained. He recorded the ship's cargo on a roll of papyrus, sealed the list with a wax imprint of the grain merchant's mark, and double-checked the tension of the mooring lines. His tunic, damp from river spray, clung to his shoulders, and his wax tablet bore the smudges of long use. A lantern swung gently from the mast, illuminating the lines of his face, worn and thoughtful. Along the edge of the field of Mars, a sternaturus, or street layer, continued work begun earlier in the day. Responsible for leveling stones in a newly laid section of road, he used a long-handled tamper to press each slab into the fine gravel beneath. By working at night, he avoided the disruption of foot and cart traffic. His tools included a flat shovel, a chisel for shaping stones, and a bronze rod for measuring alignment. He worked by lamplight, his motions deliberate, shoulders rising and falling in rhythm with each downward press. The scent of crushed basalt and damp soil lingered in the air. As the surface grew even and flat, he scattered a thin layer of sand and swept it across the joints, filling each space until the road appeared as a smooth, continuous surface. In a domus near the theater of Marcellus, a Matea Ancilla, or servant responsible for kitchen hammers and tools, scrubbed the implements used in the day's meal preparation. Her basin was filled with warm water mixed with ash soap, and her cloth was rough but effective. She cleaned each item, a meat tenderizer of olive wood, a bronze pestle, a flat grinding stone, with quite efficiency. Once cleaned, the tools were dried with linen, rubbed with oil to prevent rust or cracking, and placed in their designated box lined with straw. She moved without haste, her attention focused solely on the condition of the items entrusted to her care. The small window above her showed only the faint glow of stars. Above the rooftops, higher than most others, a vigiles, a member of the city's fire brigade and night watch, stood watch atop an observation post. From his vantage, he could see plumes of smoke, signal torches, and the faint flickering lights in tenement windows. He rotated shifts with fellow vigils, keeping the city's fire hazards in check. Equipped with a bell, a leather bucket, and a hooked pole used to dismantle burning roofs, the vigils were Rome's quiet protectors of the night. Though rarely summoned, their presence offered reassurance. The vigiles adjusted his cloak against the breeze, leaned on the railing, and resumed his silent observation of the sleeping city. Even in these late hours, Rome continued not with noise, but with endurance. Every oil lamp trimmed, every rope coiled, every tablet recorded, each movement a subtle note in the great and unending song of maintenance. These were not the acts of heroes, but of caretakers, not poets, but preservers. The unseen and the overlooked, they formed the foundation of empire, not through conquest, but through constancy. In their hands, the fabric of Roman life was not woven grandly, but carefully, again and again, until dawn would return and the cycle begin anew. As the final watch of the night unfolded across the sleeping city, the darkness settled not with fear or stillness, but with calm, well-practiced continuity. The empire, so often portrayed in scroll and stone through the deeds of generals and statesmen, in truth drew its lasting breath from those who worked without announcement, who labored not for renown but for rhythm, the quiet, circular movement of order, trade, and function. Rome did not sleep entirely. It merely exhaled. Within the confines of a domus belonging to a retired centurion near the Porta Praestina, the lanipendius, or household weigher of wool and fabric, organized a small collection of scales, weights, and bolts of cloth under the light of a single oil lamp. Though his work was not always required at night, requests for garment weighing sometimes came late, especially from households preparing gifts, dowries, or temple donations. He used bronze weights marked in libre and unciae, calibrated carefully against a marble slab. The wool, often dyed and carefully spun, was measured not only by weight, but by consistency. He moved his fingers across the fabric to feel for thickness, uniformity, and texture. His notations, made with a stylus on a wax tablet, included source, color, and balance accuracy. The surrounding silence allowed each creak of the scale to be noted and registered. On a sloping street behind a row of shrines to lesser-known deities, the sarsenatrix, or female mender of garments, completed her final stitch of the night. Seated on a cushion of stuffed linen, her lap bore a folded tunic with a worn seam. Her eyes were accustomed to dim light. She required no candle beyond the one already flickering at her side. With a needle of bone and thread made from spun flax, she executed short, precise stitches, reinforcing the garment's underarm where daily friction had worn the fibers thin. Beside her, folded garments waited for morning delivery, a servant's cloak, a child's woolen wrap, and the hem of a stola, too long for its wearer. Each piece carried signs of use and wear, signs which the sarsenatrix addressed, with quiet attention and skill passed down from her grandmother. In the vaulted passageways below, a basilica, originally designed for civic proceedings, but now used to store documents and tax records, a tabularius, or records clerk, reviewed a series of parchment scrolls by lamplight. Though many such duties were performed in daylight, he often preferred the stillness of night for copying and reconciling duplicate records. He unrolled each scroll slowly, weighing down its edges with carved weights of terracotta. His quill, trimmed and dipped in lampblack ink, moved at a deliberate pace, tracing each letter with emphasis on clarity rather than speed. He did not correct by striking through errors, but by carefully scraping off the ink with a curved knife and smoothing the surface with pounded chalk before rewriting. By his side sat a box of sealed tags, leaden labels attached to documents by cord, each marked with the name of a magistrate or tax assessor. His hours passed without interruption, defined only by the diminishing length of the oil in his lamp. Beyond the Esquiline gate, among the open fields dotted with low structures and animal pens, the armentarius, or herdsman of cattle, moved through a fenced enclosure. His cattle, a mix of red-coated and gray varieties, slept standing or lying in the straw, their breath visible in the cool night air. The armentarius checked each beast in turn, placing a hand upon the flank or back, feeling for abnormal heat, wounds, or signs of distress. He carried a small pot of ointment made from pig fat and crushed herbs, applying it to minor scrapes. His dogs, quiet and responsive, remained close. Every few steps he paused and listened, not for danger, but for irregularity. The low hum of insects, the rustle of hay, and the slow snorting of oxen filled the space between tasks. Not far away, a Tegularius nocturnus, or tile layer working under torchlight, continued repairs on a section of roof damaged during the prior week's rainfall. The residence was that of a small religious college, and repairs had to be completed before the morning service. The Tegularius, balanced carefully on the wooden scaffolding, reaching into a basket for flat imbresses and curved tegulae. Each tile was set in a bed of lime mortar, smoothed by hand and gently pressed into alignment with its neighbors. He worked slowly, the soft scuff of his sandals against the roof and the scrape of tile on stone the only signs of movement. Once a section was set, he covered it with a cloth to keep the mortar from drying too quickly in the cool air. His progress was measured not by speed, but by precision. Back within the city proper, under the covered colonnade of the portico of Octavia, the cemeterius, or decorative plasterer, sat beside a crate of carved molds. Though not a high artisan, his work was important in restoring the worn plaster ornamentation of public halls and entryways. During the daytime, his molds would be pressed into wet plaster to replicate patterns, scrolls, leaves, waves, and rosettes. But at night, he cleaned and repaired them. Each mold, made from terracotta or wood, bore traces of lime and pigment. The cemeterius scraped them gently with a sliver of bronze, washed them in vinegar, and dried them by placing them on warm bricks. When needed, he recut dulled edges with a file. His hands moved with habitual calm, guided by a practiced memory of form and pattern. Near the grain market, inside a two-room flat above a cooper's shop, the liberator nocturnus, or night cleaner, concluded his day by preparing the tools for the morrow. Hired by the state to assist in keeping key alleys and marketplaces free of debris, he carried a broom made from stiff reeds bound with cord, a dustpan of tinned copper, and a large sack for refuse. Though most of his work was complete by nightfall, he still took time each evening to examine his broom for fraying, and to soak its end in water to keep it pliable. He washed his feet in a shallow bowl, unwrapped his scarf, and tucked his simple tools beneath the wooden bench where he slept. His room held no decoration, only order. Across the city in the shadow of the Pons Fabricius, the oldest bridge in the city still in use, the Compitularius, a caretaker of street shrines, refilled a small oil lamp nestled between two marble posts. These compital shrines, found at crossroads and neighborhood intersections, were tended regularly, sometimes by volunteers, sometimes by assigned workers of the vicus. The Compitularius trimmed the wick, replenished the oil, and wiped clean the stone base where ash had accumulated. He also replaced a dried laurel branch with a fresh cutting and realigned a votive tile that had been dislodged. As he worked, the lamp's flame began to glow again, casting a golden pool of light over the worn inscription that named the household spirits to whom the shrine was dedicated. Far beneath the surface of the forum, in the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, the Cloacarius, or sewer inspector, moved slowly through the vaulted tunnel with a torch bound in pitch-soaked rags. His task was not glamorous, but it was essential. He checked the flow of wastewater, inspected stone joints for erosion, and ensured that the secondary inlets remained free of blockage. The air was heavy, but breathable. His boots, made of thick leather, sloshed quietly in the trickling stream beneath. He carried a hooked pole for removing debris, a small chisel for chipping away mineral buildup, and a rag soaked in vinegar tied around his neck to mask the scent. His work was slow, deliberate, and known only to a few above. And so the night moved onward, marked not by bells or proclamations, but by the small acts of countless workers whose names were seldom spoken, whose hands maintained a city of stone and breath. In every quarter, alley, and archway, a quiet order persisted, a testimony to the weight carried by the forgotten, by the ever-watchful, by those who kept the empire's heart beating not with spectacle, but with steady, silent care. As the final hour before dawn approached, a soft, imperceptible shift began to unfold across the city of Rome. It was now not a single event, but 1,000 gradual motions. A clay lid gently lifted, a shutter cracked open to admit the faintest pre-dawn light, a footfall where none had been for hours. The city, though vast and crowded, turned itself quietly toward morning, like a sleeper adjusting without waking. And even in this hour, labor continued, steady, muted, and largely unseen. High above the forum, in a rooftop garden of a modest domus belonging to a retired notary, the florilegus, or flower gatherer, began his work. His task was not tied to ceremony or luxury, but to rhythm, the slow upkeep of plants destined for shrines, bathhouses, and funerary offerings. He moved silently among terracotta pots filled with rosemary, marjoram, violets, and rue. The air was cool, damp with dew. He snipped blossoms with a small bronze blade, placing them carefully into a shallow woven basket lined with cloth. Each flower was assessed for symmetry, fullness, and scent. Once gathered, he would descend the narrow stairs to sort them by purpose, some destined for wreaths, others for infusion in oils or baths, others still for simple adornment at street shrines. His presence was known only to a few, yet his role was dependable, unfailing. Not far from the theater of Pompey, a Sericarius, or silk preparer, tended to his fragile work in a dim, low-ceilinged shop. Though true silk was imported from the East, the Sericarius was responsible for its handling once it reached Roman hands. He worked with utmost care, fingers moving across lengths of translucent fabric, stretched between dowels. The cloth was moistened with a fine mist of water, an alum solution to maintain softness. He untangled threads with bone needles, smoothed edges, and coiled finished sections into scrolls for delivery to garment makers and embroiders. His shop was kept dry and clean, his sandals never worn indoors, his breath quiet to avoid unsettling the fibers. The bolts of silk, barely audible as they shifted, shimmered softly in the early light. Elsewhere, in a modest atrium house occupied by a minor equestrian official, the anagnostes, or household reader, practiced his recitations. Though often a Greek slave or freedman, the anagnostes was valued for his literacy and calm voice. By the flicker of a nearly spent oil lamp, he read aloud from a scroll of Livy, not for entertainment, but to sharpen his cadence and ensure accuracy for the day's formal reading. His voice was barely above a whisper, each syllable placed with intention, each pause observed with natural grace. He did not rush. Between passages, he dabbed his fingers with chalk to ensure a steady grip and reviewed notes written in a margin. At sunrise, he would read to his patron and any guests at the morning meal, his voice a gentle addition to the quiet rituals of breakfast and preparation. Along the curve of the Janiculum Hill, near the gardens and outbuildings that served larger villa estates, a courtyards, or bark peeler, prepared his small load of harvested cork bark. His work was seasonal, and the preparation occurred mostly in the still hours before dawn. He sorted strips of bark removed the day before, trimming away imperfections with a curved knife, and stacking them in uniform bundles. These would be used by craftsmen to line amphora stoppers, make floats for fishing nets, or insulate storage chests. The smell of sap and sun-dried bark lingered in the air, and the courtyards, wearing a simple woolen wrap, kept a slow pace to ensure the integrity of each piece. Nothing was wasted. Even the smallest scraps were saved for packing material or fire starter. Within a bakery compound tucked between two narrow streets, the pastores sublimes, or upper bakers, began their earliest shift. Unlike the pister who prepared the dough and maintained the millstone, the upper bakers were responsible for shaping and baking the final product. Their loaves, round, scored with distinctive lines and stamped with the bakery's mark, were formed in silence and placed into deep ovens, preheated through the night. The ovens were fed with vine wood, chosen for its low smoke and even heat. The pastores sublimes worked in a rhythm honed by years of repetition: knead, shape, stamp, bake, rotate. Their tunics were whitened with flour, their hands warm from the dough. Beside them, tall racks of flatbreads cooled gradually, the aroma already beginning to drift into the surrounding alleyways. In a tiled courtyard outside the baths of Agrippa, the strator, or groom, began washing the horses of a visiting official. He used buckets of cold water drawn from a nearby cistern, pouring them slowly along the flanks of the animals, and scrubbing gently with bunches of dried grass. The horses shifted quietly, their eyes half-lidded in early morning drowsiness. The strader moved from hoof to withers, then to mane, pausing now and again to refill his bucket. Once cleaned, he would lead the horses along a quiet lane to walk off the chill, then dry them with linen cloths before they were reharnessed. His touch was steady, his movements muted, and his attention fixed entirely upon the animals in his care. Beneath the shade of a colonnade, near the Tiber embankment, the cultrarius, or knife grinder, unwrapped his small grinding wheel and began to sharpen tools collected the evening before. His customers were butchers, cobblers, cooks, and herbalists, those whose livelihoods depended on clean, effective edges. The wheel, mounted on a wooden frame, was turned by a foot pedal, slowly and without haste. Each blade was held to the stone at a precise angle, rotated in place, and finished with a light stropping. The cultrarius wiped each knife clean with a cloth dipped in vinegar, dried it, and wrapped it in oiled parchment. He made notes in a narrow ledger, marking the return address and date for delivery. Though his work produced a soft, rasping sound, it did not disturb the early morning peace. It merely joined it. Near the temple of Castor and Pollux, a diurnarius, or day announcer, rehearsed his list of public notices. Employed by city officials to proclaim edicts, auction dates, or ceremonial announcements, the diurnarius stood in a shaded alcove and read from a wooden board where messages had been affixed in chalk and ink. He memorized the phrasing, corrected minor pronunciation, and timed his delivery with the clarity required for open-air proclamation. Though not yet speaking publicly, his breath formed quiet rehearsals, shaped by years of training. His staff, tipped with a small bronze bell, leaned against the wall beside him, ready to alert citizens when the formal announcements began later in the day. As the sky began its gradual shift from dark violet to muted gold, the city stirred, not all at once, but gently, as if Rome herself respected the work of those who had carried her through the night. The shadows withdrew slowly from doorways and arches. Lamps were snuffed or allowed to burn themselves out. Windows were unshuttered, one by one, and the final night tasks gave way, without comment or pause, to the earliest duties of the new day. And still the work continued. In the soft bloom of dawn, Rome became visible once more, not in brilliance, but in subtlety. The rooftops, lined in dull terracotta and streaked by the soot of old fires, emerged from shadow. The cobbled streets, uneven and worn by generations of passing carts, began to reflect a faint sheen of light where dew still lingered. The distant hills, once invisible, now suggested themselves in slow outline, pale and unhurried. It was not a triumphant awakening, but a steady one, as if the city rose each morning from beneath a blanket of its own memory. In the lower levels of a domus, nestled against the northern slope of the Calian Hill, the Unguentaria Nocturna, or nighttime ointment compounder, completed her final task before daybreak. She worked beside a small brazier, heating beeswax and rosewater in a bronze bowl. Her measures were precise: a single measure of almond oil, 2 pinches of myrrh, a slow stir with a cedarwood spoon. The unguents were used in temples, private baths, and in the treatment of skin ailments. Some were perfumed with crushed lavender or soaked in wine before application. She poured the final mixture into small ceramic vessels, sealed each with linen, and pressed a soft wax seal onto the cover. Once cooled, they would be passed to vendors who carried their trays into the markets before the sun fully cleared the rooftops. Not far away, in a corner stall near the Forum Piscarium, the conlineator, or polisher of bronze, opened his wooden shutters and began the careful inspection of his day's items. The objects before him were varied: candle holders, small household statues, hinges, and the occasional fibula from a local brooch maker. Using a series of cloths soaked in vinegar and ash paste, he rubbed each surface in slow, circular motions until the dull green patina gave way to a warm metallic sheen. Once polished, he rinsed the objects in clean water drawn from a nearby fountain, then dried and stacked them upon wooden trays. The conlineator worked in silence, pausing only to adjust his cloth or to turn a piece slightly toward the growing light. The scent of vinegar and metal clung to the space around him, not unpleasant, merely constant. In a shaded space behind the public latrines near the Via Nova, a scoparius, or broom maker, began assembling bundles of broomcorn and heather. His hands moved with efficiency born from repetition. Each bundle was tied tightly with twisted linen cord and then trimmed evenly across the bottom. Some brooms were long-handled, intended for sweeping courtyards and streets. Others were short and thick, made for use within homes and shops. The scoparius kept a small pot of resin nearby, used to coat the ends of handles to protect them from splintering. Once completed, the brooms were stacked in orderly rows, leaned against the stall's outer wall. Their scent, earthy, slightly sweet, drifted into the alley. He would deliver them later in the day, by handcart, walking slowly from one quarter to the next. Down along the riverbank, where the fog still lingered low over the water, the rotarius, or net weaver, sat cross-legged upon a dry plank, mending a coarse fishing net. His needle, made from bone, moved through the hemp with quiet precision, tying square knots at regular intervals. His hands were stained from the river, and the threads carried the faint odor of fish and brine. He adjusted the tension line with a small wooden wedge, ensuring that each net panel would hang evenly when submerged. Occasionally he paused to test the weight by lifting a section of the net into the morning air, letting it swing gently from his fingers. Nearby, his small boat lay moored to a post, its hull still damp from the night's catch. He would not return to the water until the sun rose higher, but his preparation continued without pause. Within the courtyard of a modest religious school, the cerarius, or waxworker, finished preparing the wax tablets for the day's lessons. He heated the beeswax gently over a small lamp and poured it in thin layers into the recessed wooden frames. Each tablet, once filled, was smoothed with the flat side of a stylus and allowed to cool upon a rack. The wax had been darkened slightly with ash for better visibility when inscribed. The cerarius also prepared new styluses, whittling their tips into fine points and rubbing them with tallow to ease the pressure on the wax surface. His shop smelled faintly of honey and pine, and his movements were unhurried. Students would arrive later to copy letters, recite lines, and inscribe short compositions. His work ensured that their tools were clean and consistent, though few would ever note the quiet precision behind their simple instruments. Just outside the city walls, in a low building surrounded by olive trees, the torcularius, or press worker, began the slow task of preparing the olive press. The stone mill, thick with the residue of the previous pressing, was cleaned with hot water and scrubbed with bunches of thyme. The torcularius and his apprentice then loaded a new basket of olives into the hopper, readying it for the slow grind. The press beam, carved from a single trunk, was adjusted with care, and the weights calibrated to press gradually and evenly. As the first turns began, the fruit cracked under the pressure, releasing a thick greenish liquid into a shallow clay basin. This mixture would settle over several hours, separating oil from pulp. The work was slow, quiet, and fragrant, an aromatic mixture of oil, earth, and wood that signaled nourishment and trade alike. In a domus belonging to a minor official near the Forum Boreum, the lavatrix domestica, or household washerwoman, gathered the family's garments from a wooden chest. She inspected each tunic for soil or damage, soaking them in a tub of cold water before applying a paste of lye and fine sand to scrub away stains. The garments were agitated by hand, then rinsed repeatedly. Once cleaned, they were wrung out and draped across lines of rope, strung between two marble columns in the peristyle. The lavatrix arranged them so that heavier garments caught the rising sun first. She then cleaned the basin, swept the floor with a short bristled broom, and returned to the inner chamber to fold dry garments stored from the previous day. She made no noise as she moved, and her presence, while constant, blended into the very structure of the house she served. Meanwhile, within the workshops attached to the theater of Balbus, the scenicus sartor, or costume repairer, adjusted the seam of a toga worn in the previous day's comedy. Though theatrical garments were often exaggerated for visibility, they required constant mending. Tears at the hem, loosened embroidery, or stretched fasteners. Using thick threads dyed to match the bold colors of stageware, he stitched by lamplight. His tools were few: shears, waxed thread, a small iron, and a tin box filled with clasps and toggles. The costumes hung upon a wooden beam, heavy and still, their colors dimmed by shadow. He completed his work just as the stagehands began to enter through the outer gates, their morning tasks beginning anew. And as the full light of morning spread across the rooftops, gilding the edges of pediments and casting long beams into open courtyards, the night's final tasks came to a close. Lamps were extinguished, tools were cleaned and stored, quiet acknowledgments passed between workers, and paths diverged until dusk would call some back again. The city breathed, as it always had, through the lives of those who filled its empty corners with purpose. They did not seek honor, only completion, and in their work, Rome endured. As the sun fully crested above the hills beyond the eastern boundary of the city, its pale golden light slipped across the curved rooftops, bathing Rome in a quiet glow that revealed, rather than transformed. The city had not changed with the light. It had simply become visible again. Walls of travertine and brick, softened by decades of wear and soot, caught the first full warmth of morning, and courtyards lit up in dusty beams filtered through pergolas and linen curtains. The sound of Rome was not loud or sudden. It rose gradually, the creak of cartwheels, the call of a fruit vendor preparing his stall, the measured clap of sandals on worn paving stones. Still, below and behind this soundscape, labor continued, hidden from the eye, persistent in its pace. In a taberna near the edge of the Forum Holitorium, a penarius, or feather seller, arranged neat bundles of goose, swan, and occasionally imported peacock feathers upon narrow wooden shelves. The feathers were sorted not by color, but by function, those for bedding, others for ink pens, a few for trimming ceremonial garments or fans. Each was examined individually, plucked of broken strands, lightly combed, and trimmed with small bronze shears. The shop smelled of dust and clean poultry down, and faintly of the lavender stored nearby to ward off mites. He tied bundles with thin twine, marked each according to weight and length, and hung the finer specimens from hooks along the ceiling beam, where they stirred slightly in the morning draught. In the lower recesses of a temple courtyard, shielded from the bustle of the outer city, a sacrarium curator, or caretaker of ritual implements, opened a small wooden chest and began inspecting ceremonial tools. Bronze bowls were polished with vinegar and chalk paste. Libation pitchers were checked for cracks and tarnish. Thin cloths used to drape sacred idols were folded and laid in cedar-lined drawers. The curator made notes on a wax tablet, recording when each item had last been used and by whom. The work was quiet, reverent, unhurried. Although the tools he handled were associated with rites and deities, his attention remained entirely on their physical care, the condition of the object, not its symbolism. He worked in a shaded corridor, where the walls bore fading frescoes of laurel and myrtle, their colors now softened to gentle ochre and green. Near the eastern market, tucked in a small side building beneath an insula, the carbonarius, or charcoal merchant, arranged cones of fuel for purchase. He handled a combination of hardwood charcoal, softwood chips, and mixed ash, all swept into neat piles according to heat output and burning time. The cones were formed by packing charcoal dust into linen sacks, pressing them into shaped molds, and drying them in a sun-warmed alcove. The carbonarius worked with gloved hands and wore a thick cloth over his mouth to filter the fine black dust that clung to everything. His skin bore permanent traces of his trade, creases darkened by soot, fingertips perpetually smudged. His customers came early: bakers, bathhouse keepers, cooks, lamp repairers. Transactions were few words, more often completed with a nod and a wrapped bundle carried off across a shoulder. Along the long stretch of the Via Appia, just before it narrowed at the gate, a lapicida, or stonecutter, resumed work on a rectangular block of travertine. Though most major stone construction was performed by teams in quarries or public building sites, this lapicida specialized in grave markers and inscriptions. His tools, chisel, mallet, straight edge, lay arranged in a cloth roll. The surface of the stone had already been smoothed. Now he incised each letter of a name and date with painstaking care. He worked in Latin capitals, measured and spaced using thin chalk lines and a lead stylus. The chisel struck the stone softly, each tap echoing faintly in the alley behind him. The dust gathered on his tunic, like pale mist. He worked not for grandeur, but for clarity, so that even the forgotten might be remembered with dignity. Not far from a portico, where vendors sold herbs and salted almonds, the calefactor thermarum, or bathhouse furnace operator, managed the underground hippocaust system of a public bath. His domain was out of sight, beneath the tiled floors and heated rooms, surrounded by soot-blackened walls and echoing chambers. The hippocaust required constant maintenance. He fed it with chopped wood, measured the heat by placing a hand near the floor stones, adjusted vents by turning small bronze plates built into the structure. If the steam room grew too hot, he cooled it by opening a clay damper. If the tepidarium lagged in warmth, he increased the fuel. He rarely saw the bathers themselves. His presence was only noted when the warmth failed or the room steamed too little. Yet each bather, who sighed in comfort above, did so because of his unseen, steady attention. Further uphill in a wealthy neighborhood, the vestiplicus, or garment folder, worked in the servants' quarters of a senator's household. He dealt not in washing, nor mending, nor dyeing, but in presentation. Tunics were folded into thirds, cloaks into long symmetrical rolls. Togas, especially ceremonial ones, were arranged over carved forms to prevent creasing. He aligned borders, ensured pleats remained distinct, and prepared each set of garments upon a cedarwood stand with matching shoes and belt. His hands moved like those of a librarian, precise and calm, knowing each fold by habit. He made no noise, even as he unrolled linen towels to be placed beside the morning bath. The scent of pressed fabric and oil of bay leaf lingered faintly in the air. By mid-morning the vasselutor, or dish cleaner employed by a modest roadside tavern, began his shift. In a shaded courtyard behind the kitchen, he stood before a stone basin where dishes were scrubbed with sand and scalding water. The amphora shards used for scraping were stacked beside him, worn smooth from repeated use. He cleaned wooden trenchers, small cups, and ceramic bowls, then set them upon a rack built into the outer wall to dry. The sun did the rest. He hummed quietly to himself, not from joy but from rhythm, a tune as ingrained as the routine of lifting, scrubbing, rinsing, and setting aside. He paid no mind to the kitchen's noise or to the servants passing behind him. His world consisted only of water, clay, and time. And high in a tower overlooking a small district near the Aventine, the horologiarius, or timekeeper, adjusted the weights and pulleys of a public water clock. The clepsydra, as it was known, marked time not with bells but with flow. Water passed from one vessel to another at a calibrated rate, raising a float attached to a scale marked with the Roman hours. Each morning, the horologiarius refilled the upper vessel and adjusted the aperture based on seasonal calibration. Daylight hours were longer or shorter depending on the time of year. He recorded changes in a small codex and tested the descent of the float, listening to the slow drip echo in the chamber. No one watched him work, but all relied on the accuracy of the hour. Merchants, priests, magistrates, and schoolmasters alike. And so, as Rome stretched into full morning, these forgotten professions continued their quiet labor beneath the more visible rhythms of civic life. Their voices remained low, their movements unremarkable, their spaces peripheral, but the strength of the city did not come from the center alone. It radiated outward, from the shadows, the corridors, the cellars, and the alleys, each corner sustained by hands that never sought to be remembered, only to perform their tasks with constancy. In this continuity, in these ordinary acts repeated each day, Rome endured not with triumph, but with gentle, persistent balance. By the time the Roman sun had fully cleared the distant horizon and cast its light directly down into the courtyards, alleyways, and atria of the city, the public life of Rome was once again in full procession. And yet, woven quietly beneath the sound of senators speaking in porticos and merchants calling prices from beneath striped awnings, the more subdued work continued without pause. These were the occupations whose names rarely appeared on dedications or tombs, and whose tasks, though unnoticed by most, formed the scaffolding of daily life. On the southern slope of the Palatine, in the workshops near the servants' quarters of an old patrician household, the fibularius, or class polisher, bent over a row of small bronze pins. These were not the elaborate fibulae worn by matrons on feast days, but everyday fasteners, the sort used by children, slaves, and common laborers. Each piece, already forged by the nearby metalsmith, came to him dulled and uneven. With a handful of chalk dust and a bit of goat fat, he rubbed the surface until it bore a muted sheen. Then, using a loop of soft twine, he checked the hinge and tension, ensuring it would not fail when pinned to a woolen tunic or coarse linen robe. He worked on a low stool, and beside him lay a shallow bowl of water, which he used to test for any hidden cracks. As he worked, he occasionally paused, not to rest, but to examine the day's light creeping slowly across the tiled floor. His measure of time. Near the Porta Capena, where pilgrims entered the city from the Via Appia, the Mulier Aquaria, or water-woman, began her route with 2 large amphorae, balanced across her shoulders on a wooden yoke. She was not employed by the state, nor was she a slave, merely a free woman whose daily income came from carrying water to tenement residents who lived too far from fountains or wells. She walked with care, avoiding the wagon ruts in the road, stepping over errant stones, and shifting her weight evenly to avoid sloshing the contents. Her stops were regular: a shopkeeper in need of clean water for cooking, an elderly widow who paid in bread crusts and dried apples, a fuller who preferred his first pail by the 3rd hour. Her pace was unhurried, her route unchanging, her presence marked not by noise, but by the sound of clay against wood and the subtle creak of the yoke under load. Elsewhere in the city, in the more affluent district near the Gardens of Sallust, a capillimentarius, or wig-maker, worked with strands of imported hair, some sourced from captured Gauls, others traded from regions across Asia Minor. The strands were boiled, cleaned, combed, and dyed using crushed walnut shells or iron salts for varying tones. He constructed wigs on padded forms made from plaster, stitching the hair into a netting base woven from fine linen. Wealthy women would wear these creations under elaborate veils or circlets, while others were used for performances and ceremonial display. Each wig took several days to complete, and the capillimentarius kept small drawers filled with pins, beads, and fillets for customization. His room was silent, and he spoke little, except to issue careful instructions to his assistant, who handled the sorting and cleaning of raw hair. The scent of oils and dye soaked into the walls. Along the open portico of the Saepta Julia, the scrinarius, or box-maker, displayed a row of wooden writing chests, each carefully joined and polished with beeswax and lemon oil. These small containers were used by clerks, students, and magistrates to hold scrolls, wax tablets, styluses, and inkwells. His skill was in the detail: dovetailed joints, bronze hinges filed smooth, and compartments sized with mathematical accuracy. Some bore decorative touches, Greek motifs along the rim, or laurel patterns pressed into the leather lining. Others were plain and functional. He explained these features softly to passing visitors, lifting lids without clatter, turning keys gently in their locks. When no one approached, he returned to his bench to work, sanding down a new lid, while sunlight streamed gently across the grain of the wood. Just past the Porta Esquilina, where the city began to thin into garden plots and terraced farmland, the unguentarius rusticus, or rural ointment seller, prepared his stall for the day. His selection was small: pots of honey mixed with thyme for wounds, jars of fig resin for cracked heels, packets of dried mint for tooth powder, and little amphorae of vinegar steeped in garlic to be used as liniment. These were not fine perfumes for noble women, but practical remedies for laborers, muleteers, and shepherds. He sat on a folded cloth, arranging his wares on a plank, supported by 2 upturned baskets. A small sign, carved into driftwood, announced his prices in crude script. He did not call out. Those who needed his goods already knew where to find him, and his stall remained still under the mid-morning sun, like a stone placed quietly beside a well-used path. Within a shaded cloister of a public library near the Temple of Peace, the paginarius, or scroll preparer, worked at a low desk with his tools arrayed neatly before him, trimmed reeds for writing, inkpots of lamp-black and red ochre, narrow scrapers, and a tray of sand for drying. His task was to copy by hand administrative reports submitted by regional magistrates. These were not grand literary works or philosophical treatises, but routine tallies of tax collection, shipments, and census updates. He formed each letter in a slow, deliberate hand, using Latin cursive, suited to official correspondence. When he reached the end of a sheet, he affixed the next section of papyrus with paste and rolled it evenly upon a wooden dowel. At the end of his labor, he would tie the scroll with a cord, attach a leaden seal stamped with a magistrate's mark, and store it in the archive, shelves sorted by region and year. The silence in the room was near complete, broken only by the soft whisper of papyrus and the distant coo of a pigeon nesting in the beams above. Back across the river, in the quieter lanes of Trastevere, the Saginarius, or animal feeder, worked within the narrow confines of a small holding pen that belonged to a merchant who supplied poultry and rabbits to local inns. His duty began early and continued into the day, feeding, watering, and checking the health of each animal. The feed, mostly barley mash and chopped greens, was mixed in wooden troughs and distributed in regular intervals. He monitored each animal's behavior, making note of lameness, injuries, or signs of illness. Those fit for sale were separated into small cages woven from willow, stacked neatly for delivery later in the afternoon. He worked alone, accompanied only by the quiet clucking of hens and the occasional rustle of straw. The air was warm, dry, and faintly scented with feathers and grain. As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, and the city took on the sleepy stillness of midday, shaded arcades filled with those resting from labor. But not all paused. Beneath this pause, beneath the clatter of carts and calls of hawkers, Rome remained alive with quiet action. In cellar workshops, courtyards, and back rooms, the forgotten jobs continued. One hand wrapping cheesecloth, another sweeping crumbs into a clay basin, another measuring barley with a carved scoop. No task too small, no detail too quiet to matter. Here, amid the hum of sandals, the scrape of wood, and the endless shuffle of tools across stone, the heartbeat of a city endured, not loud, not fast, but infinitely constant. As the midday heat began to settle across the tiled rooftops and open courtyards of Rome, the city sank into its slowest rhythm. Even the birds, once active in the morning air, quieted beneath the sun's steady glare. Shops lowered their awnings, fountains flowed more audibly in the absence of conversation. But beneath this lull, in spaces shaded from the height of the day, the work of the city's quiet laborers carried on with the same careful deliberation that had begun before sunrise. In a narrow shop off the Clivus Argentarius, the marmorarius, or marble inlay specialist, hunched over a low table fitted with clamps and scoring tools. His work was not the grand shaping of statues or columns, but the intricate fitting of colored stone pieces into floor mosaics, furniture panels, or wall plaques. Using a fine chisel and a small saw, with wire coated in abrasive paste, he sliced thin slivers of porphyry, serpentine, giallo antico, and black basalt into precise geometric shapes. These would be placed alongside others in patterns of interlocking triangles, circles, and braided borders. The marmorarius moved slowly, measuring each piece against the wooden template before applying a dab of lime mortar and pressing it into place. His fingers bore small scars from past slips of the blade, and the tips were stained a pale gray from the constant contact with stone dust. He paused only to blow away debris or to sip from a flask of diluted wine resting beneath the bench. Not far from the theater of Pompey, down a lane known for its dye shops, The tinctrix linaria, or wool dyer, stirred a heavy vat of madder root infusion with a long-handled paddle. Her workshop, built with stone walls and open vents near the ceiling, was shaded and damp, its floor stained with years of splashes and spills. Bundles of pre-washed wool hung in the shadows, waiting their turn, while finished skeins dried on racks beside the door, turning slowly in the breeze. The tinctrix worked with a practiced eye, judging the readiness of the dye bath not by instruments, but by hue, smell, and the way the liquid clung to the paddle. She soaked each skein for a precise count of heartbeats, then drew it out, dripping and steaming, and hung it to oxidize. She kept careful records on a wax tablet: client name, desired shade, and base wool type. Her apron bore streaks of crimson, ochre, and violet from months of layering, and she welcomed the silence that came with this time of day. In a tenement courtyard not far from the Subura, the Furuminator, or brazier repairman, knelt beside a small, dented household brazier, used for both heat and cooking. He had been called not by the landlord, but by the tenant himself, a barber who could ill afford a replacement. The Furuminator carried his own iron tongs, clamps, and a portable braising kit consisting of a tiny charcoal pan and a bellows fitted with a leather bladder. The repair was simple, a cracked seam along the side that needed to be sealed with molten bronze. He worked slowly, heating the braising rod until it softened and ran smoothly along the joint. Once cooled, he tested the vessel for leaks by pouring a small measure of water inside and tilting it back and forth. He said little, only nodding when the work was finished, then packed his tools into a worn canvas roll and disappeared down the alley without expectation of praise. Closer to the field of Mars, the Argentarius, or small-scale money changer, prepared his low table for the afternoon's clients. Unlike the bankers who operated from larger stalls or behind marble counters, the Argentarius served laborers, travelers, and market sellers who required coin conversion in modest sums. His tray held a series of weights and scales, small discs of lead and bronze precisely calibrated to the standard units: libra, uncia, and scripulum. He carried a cloth for cleaning coin faces, a small bottle of vinegar to test for counterfeit plating, and a ledger for tracking exchanges. His hands moved without haste as he weighed a client's handful of battered denarii against a set of provincial coins, adjusting for wear and local rates. His speech was minimal, and his attention absolute. Each clink of coin against metal was a kind of music, slow and deliberate, echoing quietly against the plaster walls around him. Beyond the city walls, in a vine-covered plot nestled between olive groves and vegetable fields, the clitellarius, or pack saddle maker, adjusted a rawhide strap along a wooden frame designed to fit across the back of a mule. The wooden base had been carved the day before, its arch molded to distribute weight evenly without bruising the animal's spine. He padded it with layers of straw and coarse wool bound in canvas, then fixed it in place using copper rivets and a heavy mallet. His shop was little more than a shed open to the elements on one side, with piles of cord, rawhide, buckles, and wooden forms stacked neatly against the wall. He tested each strap by pulling it taut and listening for the creak of tension, then adjusted the binding until it gave just enough under pressure. A mule's comfort determined how well it worked, and how long it lasted. His goal was not speed, but reliability. In a back room of a grain merchant's warehouse, near the Porticus Aemilia, the Sicarius, or sack stitcher, repaired linen grain sacks used for shipping flour, legumes, and barley. The sacks, having been emptied of their contents, were checked for tears, frayed seams, and weakened straps. With a curved needle made from bone and thick, waxed thread, he sat cross-legged among heaps of rough cloth, looping stitches in slow, even rows. He hummed softly to himself, a repetitive tune that matched the rhythm of his hand. Occasionally, he would test the strength of a seam by pulling it with both hands, checking for give. The room smelled of dust, grain, and old thread, and the walls bore not decoration, but nails from which hung bundles of mended sacks, ready for reuse. Nothing here was wasted. Each thread, each knot, each patch was part of a cycle that continued quietly, day after day, and in the alleys near the Circus Flaminius, as the sun passed its zenith and began its slow descent into the western sky, the tegularius, or roof tile layer, carried a fresh stack of tegulae up a narrow wooden ladder to the roof of a collapsed taberna. The tiles, molded from clay and stamped with the mark of a nearby estate kiln, were stacked in bundles of 10, each carried with a rope slung across his shoulder. He worked under the full glare of the sun, laying the flat-based tiles first, followed by the curved embresses that covered the seams. He pressed them into place with slow care, checking the alignment against the course below. A small pouch at his belt held fragments of brick and lime mortar, which he used to shore up any uneven edges. The only sound was the occasional tap of tile on tile, and the low murmur of his breath as he exhaled against the heat. So continued the labors of the forgotten trades. Though midday had passed, and the day's brightness began its decline, the pace did not quicken. There was no rush, no deadline marked with flourish, only the quiet awareness of completion, a garment folded, a stitch tied, a strap tightened, a stone set in line. Rome did not run upon speeches or conquest alone. It moved forward, gently and perpetually, on the backs of those who never asked to be seen. As afternoon lengthened and the sun cast a warmer, more slanted light across the facades of temples, markets, and tenement walls, Rome began its subtle transformation once again. The intensity of noon gave way to the gentler rhythms of the later day. Shadows stretched across courtyards like lazy fingers. The noises of commerce softened but never ceased. Life continued as it always had, by motion without spectacle, by repetition without acclaim. The trades of Rome's silent majority, the practitioners of her most forgotten labors, went about their work with calm resolve. In the vestibule of a mid-sized domus near the Forum of Nerva, the capoductor, or door curtain hanger, replaced the household's summer-weight alia with a heavier version more suitable for the cooling evenings. These thick woolen drapes, dyed in muted hues, served not only as decoration, but as insulation, hung from bronze rods and held in place with finely knotted cords. The capoductor first removed the lighter fabric, folding it with care into a cedar chest. He then inspected the replacement, checking for moth holes, straightening the seams, brushing away dust with a cloth of tightly woven flax. Each tie was adjusted for equal length, and each corner secured so that the curtain would hang evenly, swaying gently with the late afternoon breeze. His task was solitary and rhythmic. The only sound was the soft rustle of wool against wall and the occasional faint knock of a bronze ring against plaster. In a corner of the Emporium, Rome's vast riverfront marketplace, the palliarius, or wool packer, began binding bales of carded wool into neat rectangular bundles for transport. The wool, collected from fullers and dyers in the city, would be shipped by cart to inland markets. The palliarius knelt beside each pile, first pressing it flat using his knees and elbows, then wrapping it tightly with coarse linen straps. The final binding was secured with twisted twine soaked briefly in water to shrink upon drying. He marked each bale with a scrap of red-dyed thread or a painted mark on wood, indicating weight and origin. The air smelled faintly of lanolin, and the bales released a soft creak as they were stacked. The process was slow and measured, with each motion chosen not for speed, but for compactness and stability. Nearby, along a wall just inside the Porta Trigemina, the formarius, or mold maker, poured damp clay into his wooden casting frames. These were used to create molds for terracotta lamps, tokens, and small religious figurines. The clay, sifted the previous day, had been mixed with fine sand and left to rest beneath damp cloths. Now, the formarius ladled it into forms carved with reversed inscriptions, or figures: Lares, Fortuna, Mercury, depending on the commission. Once filled, the molds were tapped gently to release air pockets, then set aside to dry in the filtered light beneath a canopy of worn sailcloth. After several hours, the forms would be split, the blank removed, and the mold fired in a small kiln at the back of the shop. His shelves were lined with past work, rows of identical faces, and symbols awaiting further use. He worked in silence, his hands steady, his fingers coated with clay from fingertip to wrist. Near the campus Martius, the subligariarius, or maker of undergarments, sat upon a woven mat with lengths of undyed linen spread before him. His work, often unseen, was nevertheless essential. The garments he produced, simple loincloths, breastbands, and cloth wraps, were worn daily by citizens of all classes. Using a curved bronze blade, he cut each length to a standard size, then folded and stitched the hems with flaxen thread. He used no dye, no decoration, only clean, even lines. The finished items were stacked in bundles and tied with twine. Customers rarely visited his stall with urgency. They came when needed, offering coin or barter, and left quietly. The subligariarius greeted each with a nod, then returned to his sewing, pausing only to adjust the cloth or brush away stray threads. Elsewhere, in the shade of the aqueduct arches, along the Via Tiburtina, the canteriarius, or stone polisher, worked slowly across the face of a carved marble tablet. The tablet, likely intended for a tomb or civic dedication, had been chiseled earlier by a lapidary. Now, it required finishing, edges softened, grooves cleaned, surfaces smoothed. The canteriarius used sandstone blocks and water, rubbing in even strokes to bring out the contrast between the flat background and the incised letters. He applied a paste of powdered pumice for finer areas, then rinsed the stone with a sponge dipped in rainwater from a nearby basin. His arms moved with a metronomic regularity. Each stroke revealed a little more brightness, not brilliance, but quiet precision. His fingertips often bore the fine white residue of marble dust, and he kept a cloth over his nose to avoid the particles that rose in the sun-warmed air. At the edge of the Aventine, where the city met the vegetable gardens and stables of the outer estates, the herbularius, or gatherer and preparer of medicinal herbs, assembled small bundles for delivery. The leaves had been picked before sunrise: mint, rue, horehound, fennel, and marshmallow, and now lay drying on woven trays in the late afternoon heat. The herbularius carefully sorted them, fresh for poultices, dried for infusion, crushed for powder. Using a shallow mortar of volcanic stone, he ground the leaves with a rhythmic circular motion, then poured the result into folded parchment cones or small linen pouches. Each was labeled with charcoal ink: protusum, for cough; contra vermes, against intestinal worms; ad februm, for fever. His clients included midwives, healers, and bath attendants, who used his simple preparations and treatments both real and symbolic. He spoke little, his attention fixed on his task, his world reduced to mortar, pestle, and plant. And as the sun declined toward the distant curve of the Tiber, casting long lines of light beneath the city's great arches, the last shift of workers prepared for evening tasks. The pace did not change, it merely shifted, some returning home with tools tied neatly in cloth, others stepping forward to continue where day hands had left off. There was no division by trumpet or decree, only the gentle baton pass of continuity. And in that soft exchange, the city remained, quietly, methodically, perpetually. As the afternoon gave way to early evening, and the rooftops of Rome turned amber beneath the descending light, the city exhaled once more. Shadows lengthened across tiled streets, stretching from the bases of columns, from arches and awnings, until they met and merged along the ground. Rome did not pause in these hours. It merely softened. The work of its most silent professions continued, carried on by hands that moved more by habit than command, and by eyes that had seen the same objects, the same motions, the same rhythms, year after year, without complaint. In a quiet lane near the Temple of Vesta, the fictor, or molder of small clay objects, pressed damp earth into wooden forms, carved with the likenesses of gods, animals, household tools, and protective symbols. These terracotta tokens, or sigilla, were sold at festivals or offered at shrines. The fictor's clay was mixed with care, drawn from the banks of the Tiber and sifted to remove pebbles and roots. He shaped each handful, pressed it into the mold with his palm, trimmed the excess with a strip of bronze, and set the piece aside to dry on a reed mat. Once hardened in the sun, the tokens would be fired in a low, smoky kiln fueled with brushwood. His tools were simple: a small paddle, a wooden knife, a bucket of water, and his work was marked not by innovation, but by reliable consistency. Each figure, though small and humble, bore the weight of ancient tradition. Not far from the market street known for its sellers of garum and olives, the Koku's Pistor, or cook-baker, prepared the evening's last batch of flatbread in the rear of a roadside taberna. Unlike the large bakers of the city's central ovens, his role was to make hot, soft breads to accompany lentil stew or fried fish, served quickly to travelers and workers at end of day. His dough, made early that morning, had rested under damp cloth and was now divided, rolled thin, and laid on the hot iron plate above his brazier. As the bread bubbled and browned, he flipped it with a wooden spatula, then stacked it in linen-lined baskets. The smell of yeast and smoke drifted into the street. His apron, stained from ash and flour, bore signs of long use, and his fingers moved with the muscle memory of hundreds of repetitions. He did not look up when the next customer arrived. He simply turned the next round of dough. In a shaded corner near the Arch of Titus, a depilator, or hair remover, set out his narrow bench and small iron pan of warmed resin. Though the term may suggest indulgence, his services were largely practical, removing hair for hygiene, comfort in hot weather, or preparation for bathing. His clients were mostly men, laborers, athletes, and soldiers. Using strips of linen and tree gum, he worked with short, quick motions, talking little, moving with deliberate care. A bronze mirror and a small cloth soaked in vinegar water helped cool the skin after each treatment. His trade was not glamorous, but it was trusted. He cleaned his tools with boiled water, sharpened his spatula with a stone, and folded the towels with care after each use. Beside a narrow cistern in the lower Trans-Tiberan district, the testarius, or pot cover maker, worked with scraps of fired clay and bits of straw to produce flat lids for domestic amphorae and storage jars. Unlike the potters who shaped vessels on the wheel, his role was purely utilitarian, producing the circular covers that would protect grains, dried fruits, oil, and water from pests and dust. Each lid was flattened by hand and shaped against a shallow mold. Once dry, he scored the rim to help it grip the neck of the vessel more tightly. Sometimes he added a simple stamped mark, his initials, or a line indicating size. The lids were stored in stacks against the wall, and as the shadows grew longer, he wrapped them in linen to be carted to market the next day. The air smelled of damp clay and straw, and the sound of his smoothing tool brushing against the edge of a lid was the only noise in the narrow yard. In the heart of the city, tucked behind a colonnade where magistrates met in the early morning hours, the filarius, or thread spinner, sat before a low wheel and turned flax fibers into usable thread for household weavers. The flax, soaked and combed earlier, hung in a soft tuft from a distaff balanced against her knee. With one hand she spun the wheel, and with the other she guided the fibers into a continuous, delicate thread. The finished thread was wound onto small spindles made from olive wood. She sorted these by thickness and strength. Some would become warp thread for heavy cloth, others weft for finer linen. Her spinning was near soundless, interrupted only by the gentle whir of the wheel and the soft tug as the flax was drawn into length. As evening fell, she lit a small oil lamp and continued, her posture unchanged, her thoughts tuned to the pace of the work. Outside the city walls, along a gentle bend in the road, lined with cypress and stone markers, the viator, or state messenger, dismounted from his mule and checked the scroll tucked into the leather satchel at his side. His job was not one of decision, but of transmission, delivering notices from one town to the next, from one governor to another, from an office in Rome to a post on the distant coast. He wore a short wool cloak and sandals reinforced with strips of hide. He carried no weapons, only a wooden baton marked with the seal of his office. At this hour, he would seek shelter in a small roadside hostel or stables, wash the dust from his arms, and prepare his horse for the morning. His message would not be read until the next day, but its journey continued through the fading light, each step measured by the turn of a wheel, the sound of hooves, the rustle of a scroll tied with cord. As evening neared its end and lamps were lit within domus and taberna alike, the final tasks of the daylight workers were folded away, lids tied down, cloths shaken free of flour, bowls stacked and covered with wax cloth. The air cooled. The stone held the warmth of the day. In the silence between shifts, the city took a breath, not to rest, but to prepare for the next quiet exchange. One set of hands passed their work to another. One door closed as another opened. Rome's greatest continuity lay not in conquest or wealth, but in its calm ability to carry itself forward, hour by hour, labor by labor, through the persistence of those who worked without fanfare, who asked nothing but the time and space to do their part well. As the final edge of sunlight slipped below the distant horizon, and the sky over Rome deepened from amber to gray, the city did not fall into silence. It shifted gently, as it always had, moving from the work of day to the labors of night. The streets cooled beneath their layers of worn stone, and the distant sounds of carts and voices thinned. Lamps glowed behind lattice windows. Oil wicks flickered against painted plaster walls. And still, within the narrow arteries of the eternal city, the unending rhythm of quiet work continued. In the servants' wing of a large domus near the Carinae, the Cultrarius Nocturnus, or nighttime blade cleaner, moved through his narrow chamber, cleaning the kitchen's knives, cleavers, and skewers. These tools, used throughout the day by the cook and his apprentices, were rinsed in warm water, dried carefully, then oiled with a cloth soaked in vinegar and rosemary. The Cultrarius did not speak. He did not need to. His duty was to preserve the sharpness, the balance, the readiness of tools that others relied on. Each blade was tested along a narrow strip of reed, its edge examined in the lamplight, then stored in a chest lined with linen and straw. A shallow basin collected the rinse water, and the stone floor beneath him had worn smooth from his countless steps between bench, basin, and shelf. Beneath the floor of a bathhouse near the Esquiline, the Hippocostarius, a keeper of the Hippocaust system, adjusted the small fires that warmed the floor and walls above. The heat needed to be just so. Enough to ease the muscles of the late evening bathers, but not enough to cause discomfort or waste. He moved with a heavy iron poker, shifting the embers gently, spreading them beneath the raised floor tiles. Occasionally, he would check the terracotta flues built into the walls, ensuring they remained open. Ash was scraped into a pail and removed quietly. He carried a cloth over his nose, not out of revulsion, but habit. And his hands bore the soot of hundreds of such nights. He did not emerge to see those who soaked in the caldarium above. His presence was beneath them, literal and necessary. Near the southern boundary of the forum, the Lychnopolists, or lamp oil refiller, began his final round. Employed by a district steward to keep lamps filled in public porticos and shrine niches, he carried a yoke with 2 pots, one of thick olive oil, the other filled with spare linen wicks. By torchlight, he refilled small bronze and terracotta lamps, affixed to walls, or resting in carved niches. He replaced burned-out wicks with fresh ones, checking the alignment of the flame and trimming any soot-blackened edges. His pace was slow. Each lamp was a small duty, but the total was many. His shadow moved softly across the walls, flickering behind columns and disappearing down corridors. He made no announcements, issued no sound beyond the soft clink of bronze against clay. In the narrow alley behind a bakery in the Subura, the panis dispensator, or bread distributor, finished his ledger. He tallied the number of unsold loaves, counted coins gathered throughout the day, and packed a modest stack of leftover bread into a crate for donation to a nearby shrine. He wore a tunic streaked with flour, and his sandals were dusted white from the stone floor. With a damp cloth, he wiped down the small table where bread had been cut and weighed. His stylus, smoothed from years of use, scratched softly across his wax tablet as he recorded his totals for the steward. His work was not baking, but numbers, tracking, counting, recording, and it was done with the same attention to order that defined the baker's hearth. Across the Tiber, in a modest workshop tucked behind a line of vine-covered walls, the corymbarius, or garland maker, tied the final knot on a wreath of laurel and dried myrtle. His fingers, stained green from leaves and herbs, moved over the twine with precision. These garlands would be sold at temples, placed above doorways, or worn during festivals. Some were adorned with bits of ribbon, others left plain. He worked by lamplight, seated cross-legged on a reed mat, surrounded by baskets of cuttings gathered that morning. The scent of greenery hung in the air, fresh, sharp, slightly bitter. When finished, he set the garlands in a low wooden crate and covered them with a cloth dampened at the edges to keep the leaves from curling overnight. In a tiny apartment high in an insula near the Forumborium, the calceolarius, or cobbler, ended his day by preparing soles for morning repair. By the low light of a clay lamp, he traced outlines on strips of cowhide, using an awl to mark where each nail would go. His hammer, smoothed by touch, rested beside a pile of hobnails gathered from the marketplace. The soles would be shaped and attached the next day, once the glue made from boiled animal hide had softened overnight. He worked in silence. His wife slept nearby. Outside his shuttered window, the sounds of the city dwindled to an intermittent murmur, the occasional creak of a cart, a bark from a distant dog, the faint ring of a closing door. Finally, upon the janiculum, from the tower of a small shrine to Silvanus, a Tibicen nocturnus, or night flute player, lifted his double flute to his lips and played a soft, slow tune into the cooling air. His job, ancient and symbolic, was to mark the passing of night hours for the local district, once ritual, now tradition. The song was not meant to rouse or entertain, but to signal gently the progression of time. Each note rose and fell like breath, carried over rooftops and lost among fig trees and chimneys. Few listened consciously. Most had heard it so many times that it barely registered, but in its quiet way, it wove itself into the pattern of sleep and stillness, a final thread in Rome's endless fabric. And so, as stars began to gather above the great city, small lights above an empire of countless lives, the work of the day came to rest. Not in grand conclusions, not in final acts of triumph or drama, but in the simple setting down of tools, in the covering of goods, in the banking of fires, in the slow exhalation of effort. These were the forgotten jobs of Rome, not forgotten because they were unimportant, but because they asked nothing of memory. They were constant, reliable, humble. They shaped the city more than its monuments ever did. They carried its weight, bore its breath, and kept its time. And even now, as all quiets at last, they wait, silent and enduring, for the next day to begin.